To hear the full episode, become a patron at patreon.com/deathpanelpod.
Welcome to the Death Panel. Patrons, thank you so much for supporting the show. None of the work that we do would be possible without you. To become a supporter of the Death Panel and get access to the second weekly bonus episode, as well as the entire back catalog of bonus episodes, become a patron at patreon.com/deathpanelpod. And to help us out some more, share the show with your friends, post about your favorite episodes, pick up copies of Health Communism, Counting Like a State, and Abolish Rent at your local bookstore, or request them at your local library, and follow us at deathpanel_. I'm Beatrice Bolton, and I'm once again joined by returning guest and dear friend of the panel, Vicky Osterweil. Vicky is a brilliant author, worker, and agitator. She is the author of the 2020 book, In Defense of Looting, A Riotous History of Uncivil Action. She frequently writes about revolt, history, culture, anarchy, and technology as a founding member of CAW, that's CAW, a worker-owned anarchist journal of arts and culture. And her new book is called The Extended Universe, How Disney Killed the Movies and Took Over the World, which just came out recently from Haymarket. And as I promised you all when we had her on a few weeks ago to talk about the State Department and the Trump administration declaring a new Red Scare, we're going to talk about her book today, and I'm really excited. So, Vicky, welcome back to the show.
Thank you so much. It's such a delight to be back so soon.
Seriously. So your new book, The Extended Universe, How Disney Killed the Movies and Took Over the World. Ostensibly, this is a book about the film industry, about Disney Corporation, the rise of the franchise era of media. But to describe it that way is actually to do it a very great disservice, I think. And anyone who reads past the first page is really met quickly with the truth. This is a much bigger project than a leftist history of Disney. And really, it's a story about capitalism, monopoly, and the way that private property organizes access to all the collectively produced things that we need to live. Because what you're talking about is systems that really concretely connect things like the entertainment industry, the production of culture, to imperialism, state power, the carceral state, the, discovery and production of medicines, the production of food, the distribution of food, really just like all of the kind of foundational pillars that can either construct scarcity or abundance. So with all that said, I really love the book. I'm excited to get into it. For folks who haven't read it, can you just start by walking through really the central point that you're arguing in the extended universe, rather than jumping immediately into Disney or intellectual property law, right? I'd love for us to sort of center for people what you're actually arguing underneath it all. And since you know the Death Panel community very well, you're a part of it even, as I was saying before we started, I'm really curious if you'll say a little bit about how you also see this book like connecting to what we cover here on the show as a sort of, I guess, direct and personal appeal to other Death Panel listeners as to how exactly this does relate to what we talk about all the time here. Totally.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for that overview. I really do appreciate it. I think lots of people have told the history of Disney. In some ways it's well-trod ground, but also it's not the thing I'm most interested in, as you point to, although it is quite interesting, obviously. So when I was first working on the book, when I had first had it as a proposal, and then when it was sort of getting, I would tell people, I'm working on this new book, and people would say, "Oh, what's it about?" And I'd say, "Oh, it's about Disney and movies and intellectual property." And as soon as you say the word intellectual property, people's eyes like roll into the back of their head and they fall asleep, right? Like it's just like it's such a boring concept. It's structurally, ideologically.
A pervert like us.
Yeah, right. I mean, exactly. But it's designed that way, right? Part of the way it has functioned successfully for the last 50 years, particularly, but honestly, a century, is its highly technical business and legal framework, which again, that's something that will be familiar to disability and health justice folks, right? Mm-hmm. Is that like the way that certain kinds of legalese and technical bureaucratic maneuvering can make things seem inaccessible and non-understandable, right? But it was frustrating to watch my friends be like, "Okay, Vicky, whatever," while I was like working on a book that was taking all my energy. So eventually I learned to say, well, this book is about why all superhero movies are the same and why in 2021, Disney sent lobbyists to stop the Biden administration from sharing the coronavirus vaccine with the third world, and why the explanation for those two things is the same, right? And so I think in many ways, what this book is trying to do and talk about is the way that those technical quote unquote boring material, legal, and ideological regimes, in this case, intellectual property in particular, copyright, patent, and trademark, shapes our world, and so like shapes aesthetically and emotionally the experience of the world that we have by consuming the culture made under its image, right? I mean, in some ways, it's a maybe almost basic sort of Marxist argument about how the material conditions of its production shape the way we see it. But I think trying to make that visible to people, because I think so often the way we think about and talk about intellectual property in general is that it's sort of like, if we talk about it at all, it's either a sort of defensive crouch from artists who understandably are frustrated at having been ripped off over and over again, especially in this era where there's no way to make money with your culture unless you're like, either born into money or like extremely, extremely lucky, So I think a lot of people have ended up defending copyright as the only tool left for artists or whatever. You see this in the critique of AI. Now I'm sort of getting a little off topic here, but I think what I'm trying to demonstrate is that intellectual property is extremely exemplary form of property. It is not a different form of property. It is not a special form of property, like many of the people who talk about it argue, because it's immaterial, right? Like it's like, oh, well, how, you don't really own a copyright. It can only actually exist in terms of like the enforcement of the state. But like, how is a landlord's ownership of a building any more material? Mm-hmm. If you don't pay rent to the landlord and they can't get goons to come in either from the state or legally backed up their own violent goons, then like their ownership is meaningless, right? And so like one of the arguments I'm trying to make is that like all ownership, all property is similarly backstopped by state violence. That's one of the ones, right? That it is sort of a typical form of property, but also that when that kind of thinking, the move into intellectual property as the basis of not just culture, but of agribusiness, software, high fashion, or fast fashion more than high rather, but like fashion in general, lots and lots of retail. The only thing that those corporations actually own is their intellectual property. And how are the biggest corporations in the world capable of owning materially so little, right? Like, how does that work? And what does that mean? And what does that say about the world and about ownership and capital and the state and their interrelation? And also, how does it shape the way that we think about and understand power in terms of one thing I was thinking about a lot, which is very death panel related, like I was thinking about this in terms of medicine all the time, as you can see from the opening anecdote. But like, I think in a lot of ways, this is responding to, the chapter in Health Communism about patents and a lot of other sort of the work that's done, in the health justice and disability community, because why would HIV be a manageable disease, right? Like in one country. And if you cross the imaginary line of a border, it's a death sentence, right? Like, what is that? Because that has nothing to do with the material content of the science that's been done. I mean, well, not nothing to do, and we can get into that obviously, but you know what I mean? That's a legal and capitalistic structure of profit extraction and death redistribution, right? That has much more to do with forms of power over knowledge and via knowledge that don't always look like a policeman's baton or like Gordon Gekko in or like the Wolf of Wall Street, right? Or like some highfalutin financial guy. But it can look like, oh God, what's his name? Star-Lord from Guardians of the Galaxy having his mixtape. So I think like I really wanted to pull on those threads. And I think if you just pull on them a little bit, and I certainly pulled on them a lot, I think a lot of stuff opens up.
And you make this very important methodological move very early, saying that, when we think about where economic power resides, right? Like when we think about, as you're saying, like the image of the banker, right? Like the image of the Wall Street trader, of whatever, like Davos vibes, right?
Totally.
That those obvious images of capitalism that we return to, right, are certainly useful ways of thinking also about how capital enters our lives, right? But what's actually a lot more useful and a lot easier for people to relate to is like Mickey Mouse, these things that are like cultural artifacts that are frequently like images on objects in many people's like homes and their daily lives, right? Like various sort of nostalgia franchises that are just like peppered throughout the world. And like Disney is a useful lens for having this way into actually like comprehending what contemporary capitalism looks and feels like, right? In the way that it's all around you at all times, right? And you're sort of constantly surrounded by reminders of like the Disney property regime, right? And I think it like gives us a way of thinking about how like capitalism looks and feels and also behaves the way it does, right? And that those emotional relationships like that we have with all these various property objects, that does some work in that landscape, right? In terms of like justifying itself and justifying capitalism and things like that. And again, like that's another really useful sort of one-to-one relationship with like thinking about the other emotional commitments that people have that stand in the way of like liberation, like an emotional commitment to the police, right? Or to policing, to the idea of borders, right? To the idea of private property itself and the ownership of land and things like that, right? So, you know, now that we've like talked through the book at a more conceptual level, I'm sort of, I guess, asking if you'll make the case for people how you use Disney as a case study here, right? And why it was important for you to like tease out actually the sort of like emotional relationship to objects of capital and regimes of property that is not just like a part of the Disney story, but is even especially like part of the drug development story, right? Where it's like some people will defend drug patents because they're like afraid that drugs will not be developed if companies aren't given, you know, this kind of totalizing control over profits and distribution, right? And that is a literal like propaganda line by like pharma lobbyists that has been repeated for like, you know, a century practically at this point. But people like believe that because it triggers this emotional connection of like, well, what if, you know, I can't get the cancer drug I need? What if my mom can't get the cancer drug she needs? What if, you know, my baby is born with a disease that there's a drug that could treat it that they've just got to invent, right? But they won't because we took away their exclusive right to profit from it. You know, like, so that emotional relationship, which is like harder to see in other areas, is just so fucking obvious when it comes to like Disney and objects of culture, right? That I think it makes it a fun like entry point for people, but also because like Disney itself is just like such a thing that like blankets daily life, not just in the US, but like globally speaking. It's just such a useful way into thinking also about how that kind of like emotional, nostalgic relationship and a fear of like, of having like what you know taken away, even though it's bad, right? Like how that plays into so many of the ways that people kind of like discipline themselves into, you know, complying with capitalism and not questioning it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think like even if you even with more, just to jump quickly back to the sort of defenders of capitalist pharma science, even people who are, you know, more on side, who agree that the patents are sort of ridiculous and that like the method has to be reformed, those people will often still defend the state, you know, because they'll say, well, you need the state to dole out the resources, right? So like what we just need to do is we need to reorder the state towards making those resources actually available to research instead of just profit making, which, you know, in this moment of the total gutting of the American university and science federal system is certainly compelling, you know, at this moment emotionally, right? And I think like part of why it's so important to think about IP in this way is because IP is the state's solution. To like IP is how the state manages this for capitalism. Like it is a state program. It goes through the courts and through Congress in a really direct way. Part of why it feels inaccessible to us is precisely because it's so high and legalistic and political, frankly, although not political in the sort of partisan way that we, you know, that Americans often reduce the word political to. So I think there is sort of this real deep seated belief in the way that progress has brought us to where we are. And I think what's so important for me about the argument, again, to sort of veer away, and then I'm going to come back to the specifics, but, you know, what's so important about this argument is that, like, and as the Death Panel folks do know, like, you know, medicine is 30% the most beautiful and incredible knowledge humanity has ever produced, and 70% absolutely dog shit, hierarchical exploitation, redistribution of death, and profit seeking, right? And like, you know, rather than the Maha argument of like, you know, well, clearly doctors are suspect, so just do whatever the most charismatic person convinces you to do today, right? What I think we need to do is steal that 30% back, right? Because it was made on our bodies, it was made out of our culture, out of experiments on us, you know, especially folks of color and queer folks and disabled folks. And that's our knowledge. And even if it wasn't made directly of and by us, although it was, it would still be the great wealth of humanity and the right of humans to have access to. And the state mostly stands to, even if you want to talk about the way that funding has been cut recently and how the NIH used to work, that means that the state has always been standing as a sword of Damocles or as a blackmail against science. Right? That it always had the power to withdraw this funding. And what the Trump administration did was it finally pulled that ripcord, or to completely mix my metaphor, it dropped the sword, right? It was like, okay, no, we're going to do this. And, you know, what's ridiculous about the Trump administration is like the failure to recognize that the soft power of having the sword hanging is more powerful than dropping it on the scientists, right? Whatever. Okay, fine. But that's a very different conversation. So Disney, right? Anyway, Disney, like, I think part of why it's effective is because, yeah, like if you're talking about, you know, agribusiness or pharmaceutical development, it might be interesting, but they're extremely villainous, right? Like monocultural crops are, and pharma are so villainous that even the fascist right can sort of build on critiques of them, right? To talk about Maha, right? You know, the sort of like, it's this obviously alienated and violent mode of production in the world. But Disney is really deep in all of us. If you're raised, especially in the United States or the English-speaking world, but frankly anywhere, like Mickey Mouse, you know, is one of the great symbols of America in general, right? In the 60s, when you had sort of this sort of anti-imperialist sort of cultural critique going on, you know, a lot of the times, you know, America in films like New Wave films or whatever, or third cinema films and from Latin America, a lot of times stand-ins for America would be Coca-Cola, Levi's jeans, and Mickey Mouse, right? This was the export. This is like a symbol that like means America on the world stage. It means, at least as Disney tries to argue it, the best things about America, sort of cute, young, well-meaning, funny, graphically interesting, bright, I guess is the word I'm looking for. And then for us, it also represents childhood and nostalgia. And when you attack Disney, like people get, like, it's really deep in people, right? A lot of people who talk to me, you know, you were saying about how Disney is such an important avenue for attack. A lot of the interviews I've done involve some version of the person interviewing me sort of apologizing for liking a Disney product, you know, for being like, well, unfortunately, and it's like, well, no, that's not unfortunate. Like the whole book is about how I was raised on them. That's like a big part of what I'm trying to argue.
To hear the full episode, become a patron at patreon.com/deathpanelpod.